My name is Ralph Davis, and I was married for 19 years to a woman I once believed loved me with all her heart. Sherry had convinced me we had a strong and devoted relationship, but in reality, I was nothing more than a cuckold. For the past 4 years, she had been involved in an affair with her boss, a man who owned the real estate firm where she worked. We had 3 children together, our 16-year-old daughter, a 14-year-old son, and our youngest, a beautiful little girl who had just turned 4. I loved them all, except for my wife. Before I forget, I should mention that I work as a police sergeant, which had always given me a strong sense of duty and responsibility. Everything came crashing down 3 months ago when my youngest daughter had an accident at daycare. She had fallen and gotten hurt, and the staff tried calling my wife, but she was completely unreachable. When I got the call instead, I didn't hesitate. I jumped into my car, turned on the emergency lights, and raced to her side. When I arrived, she was sitting there, sniffling, with a lollipop in her hand and tears in her eyes. I crouched down, carefully checking her over, kissed her forehead, and tousled her hair. The older kids had long outgrown such gestures, but she still loved them, and her giggles reassured me that she was handling things well. Once she had settled, I spoke with the daycare director, who explained that my daughter had taken a bad fall, injuring her leg enough to warrant stitches. They had already called an ambulance, which would be arriving in 9 minutes. I returned to my daughter's side, keeping her calm, and soon, she was laughing again despite the pain. When the emergency team arrived, the doctor assessed her and confirmed that she needed to go to the hospital. Without hesitation, I followed the ambulance, keeping close behind until we reached the emergency room. While waiting, I repeatedly tried to call my wife, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. After leaving a message, I activated the tracking app on her phone. She had a habit of misplacing it, so I had installed the feature long ago. Ironically, the phone was smart, but my wife? Not so much. The location showed her at a hotel just 7 miles away. I stayed with my daughter as the doctors stitched her up, keeping her entertained so she wouldn't get scared. Once they were done, I signed the necessary paperwork, then walked to my car. From the trunk, I pulled out a foldable child seat, carefully secured it in the back, and strapped her in. As I drove toward the comfort suites, my stomach twisted, rejecting the lunch I had eaten earlier. A deep, nagging feeling told me I wasn't going to like what I found. I pulled into the parking lot, arriving just in time to witness Sherry stepping out of the hotel lobby. Delaney, her boss, was right beside her, his left hand resting on her backside. They were laughing, looking every bit like a couple without a care in the world. Then, in an instant, she leaned in and kissed him. Not just a friendly peck, but a deep, intimate kiss. For a split second, it felt as if she was kissing me. I parked my Chevrolet, my hands tightening around the wheel as I adjusted my dash camera to zoom in. The two of them strolled across the lot toward her Cadillac Escalade, completely oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Then, she did something that made my blood run cold. Right there, in the open, she turned to him, licked his jawline, and slid her hand under the hem of her dress. In a slow, deliberate motion, she reached beneath the fabric and pulled out a pair of sky-blue lace panties, the very ones I had gifted her on our anniversary. She held them up with a smirk, sniffed them, and then handed them to him like some kind of prize. That was it. Everything was over. I struggled to process what I had just witnessed, my mind racing through memories of all the times she had lied to my face. They laughed, kissed once more, and then she climbed into her car and started to drive away. I remained frozen, watching as her brake lights suddenly flashed and the car swerved to a stop. Her vehicle remained stationary for another 40 seconds before my phone rang. I looked down at the screen. Her name appeared. I answered evenly, keeping my voice controlled. She immediately asked what had happened and where I was. I responded that I was at the hospital and reassured her that our daughter was fine. Then I turned the question back on her, asking where she was, since I had been unable to reach her. She hesitated before answering, claiming she had been at the office and that she was on her way to the hospital now. I told her to drive carefully and then hung up. Her car remained in the same spot for another 15 seconds before she called me twice more, both of which I ignored. Eventually, she continued driving, nearly crashing into a pickup truck in the process. I let out a long sigh and started heading home. As soon as I arrived, I carried my sleeping daughter inside, tucking her into bed. Then, I went back to my car and retrieved 4 DNA swab kits. Moving through the house, I took a sample from my youngest daughter, carefully sealing it inside a labeled plastic bag. Next, I made myself a cup of black coffee, sat down, and made a few important calls. First, I contacted a trusted friend, telling him that I needed to meet up and talk. Then, I called my boss, the head of the detective department, and requested time off for family matters. He asked if everything was all right. I reassured him that nothing urgent was wrong, but that I needed to consult a doctor regarding my children. He approved my leave without question, reminding me to keep him posted. About 25 minutes later, the doorbell rang. The moment I saw Sherry standing there, I felt physically sick. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, but I could only count to 6 before she knocked again. The first thing she did when I opened the door was scream, demanding to see our daughter. I kept my composure and told her to calm down, explaining that the baby was asleep. Brushing past me, she rushed into the bedroom. I remained in the hallway, pulling out my phone and mentally listing everything that needed to be done the next day. A divorce lawyer, a DNA test for all the kids, a trip to the electronics store. Moments later, Sherry emerged, her face still twisted in concern. She demanded to know exactly what had happened. I told her the truth. Our daughter had fallen, gotten hurt, and needed 5 stitches, but she had handled it well. There would be hardly any scar, and she was going to be fine. Instead of relief, her frustration only grew. She started yelling, asking why she hadn't been called. I simply told her the facts. The daycare had tried to call her multiple times, but they couldn't reach her. I had tried too. Every call had gone straight to voicemail. Then, I asked her a simple question. Where had she been? She hesitated, her voice shaky, before claiming she had been in a meeting and had turned off her phone. I already knew the truth. And soon, so would she. Instead of turning her phone off, I suggested she could have just put it on vibrate. What if something serious had happened to one of the kids? Or worse, what if something had happened to me? At that moment, her expression darkened before her face paled. It was clear she had never even considered that possibility. Of course, she hadn't. Before she could respond, our 2 older children burst through the front door after coming home from school. Tracy, still 16, and our 14-year-old son, Otis, stopped in the living room, glancing between us. The tension in the air was impossible to miss. Otis, always straightforward, immediately asked what was going on. Tracy, on the other hand, barely looked at her mother. Instead, she turned to me and asked if everything was all right. I reassured them, explaining that their little sister had taken a fall at daycare and had to get 5 stitches at the emergency room, but she had handled it like a champion. At that moment, I watched Sherry carefully. She flinched, subtle, but noticeable. Tracy wasn't done. Without taking her eyes off her mother, she asked where she had been all day. Sherry hesitated before mumbling something about a meeting, but her body language said otherwise. Otis, always observant, locked eyes with her, his gaze questioning. His voice was quieter this time, but filled with doubt. Sherry's discomfort deepened. Her face flushed, and without another word, she abruptly announced that she needed to take a shower. I couldn't help myself. With an innocent tone, I casually pointed out that she had already taken one that morning. That was it. She stumbled over her words, searching for a reaction from me, as if daring me to start an argument. When I didn't take the bait, she turned on her heel and stormed up the stairs, muttering under her breath. I turned back to the kids and was surprised to see the looks on their faces. They weren't just confused, they were devastated. The weight of what was happening was beginning to sink in for them, and it was breaking their hearts. Trying to shake off the tension, I reassured them that everything would be fine, just a simple disagreement. Tracy didn't look convinced. She muttered something under her breath, and Otis simply nodded, though the doubt in his eyes remained. Wanting to change the mood, I suggested pizza for dinner. It worked. 35 minutes later, 2 large pizzas arrived, one with pepperoni and another with mushrooms. The kids cheered, even the youngest, who was now awake and excited to join us. When Sherry finally emerged, she barely glanced at the food before making a face. She sneered that I should have ordered anchovies, knowing full well no one else in the house liked them. Without waiting for a response, she poured herself a glass of red wine and ignored the rest of us. The kids exchanged knowing glances. They didn't even have to say anything. Their disappointment in their mother's behavior was obvious. As she disappeared again, we ate together, catching up on school events, upcoming community activities, and whatever else was on their minds. Even though I tried to keep things light, the atmosphere was undeniably cold that night. Later, I grabbed an extra blanket before going to bed. It had been 4 months since Sherry and I had been intimate, and at this rate, it was only going to get harder to keep up the act. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. She had built a reputation for being relentless, especially when it came to cheaters. She had a particular disdain for unfaithful women and always had a soft spot for cops. Despite my situation, she reminded me that the courts would still favor my wife unless she agreed to my terms. I needed solid evidence, proof that would leave no room for doubt. She assured me that I was in a good position when it came to alimony since Sherry actually earned more money than I did. Even better, because of Tracy's age, she would legally be able to choose which parent she wanted to live with. That alone could work in my favor. After the meeting, I called a friend I had worked with before, someone I knew I could trust. Without hesitation, he agreed to start surveillance on Sherry and her lover. He wouldn't charge much, and by the time he was done, I'd have exactly what I needed. From there, I headed to an electronics store and purchased several wireless voice recorders, along with 3 small video cameras. Once I got home, I wasted no time installing them. One camera went into the master bedroom. Another was set up in the living room, and the third was placed in the guest room. As for the voice recorders, one went inside Sherry's car. Another was discreetly placed on the bookshelf in the living room. The last one was hidden inside the master bedroom. Not long after, I received a text message from Sherry. She was going to be home late and expected me to watch the kids until she returned. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I went to pick up my youngest and brought her home to start dinner. Roughly 2.5 hours later, the older kids came home. As we started discussing dinner options, I suggested grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, and creamed spinach. Tracy agreed that it sounded good, but Otis smirked slightly and asked what their mother would want. I told him she could cook her own dinner. Tracy and Otis exchanged a knowing glance before Tracy turned serious. She told me that we needed to talk. I already knew what was coming. Moving to the kitchen, I continued preparing dinner as she started speaking. Without hesitation, she told me she believed Sherry was cheating. She had suspected it for a long time, but now she was sure. She felt that her mother didn't respect me and was never around when they needed her. Otis, without missing a beat, immediately agreed. Hearing it from them hurt more than I expected, but at the same time, I was proud of them. They had sharp instincts and saw things for what they were. Wherever they had gotten their intelligence, I was grateful for it. Setting everything aside, I pulled them both into a group hug. Almost instantly, their youngest sister came running in, yelling, "Me too! Me too!" as she wrapped her tiny arms around us. Looking at them, I knew one thing for certain. I loved them more than I loved myself. I had always told my kids how much I loved them, even if they sometimes found it corny. But deep down, I knew they liked hearing it. This time, though, my words carried more weight. I told them things weren't looking good, and I was keeping a close eye on their mother's actions. But no matter what happened, they needed to know that my love for them would never change. The youngest, full of innocent curiosity, spoke up, suggesting that I should get cheek swabs from all of them. She believed it could help my case. It wouldn't change her feelings toward me, but she thought it would be good to know how rotten their mother truly was. Tracy immediately agreed. Right now, she wasn't feeling much love for her mother either. Their words left me stunned. I hated that they were being forced to see the ugly truth about the woman who had raised them. But they deserved answers, and I couldn't lie to them. I told them we would get it done before their mother got home. Taking the DNA swabs, I started with theirs first, then my own. Once they were all sealed in labeled containers, I locked them in my briefcase for safekeeping. The next morning, I took the samples to an independent lab and requested an express DNA analysis. It cost more than usual, but I wanted the results as fast as possible. Exactly 13 days later, the results arrived. Not a single one of the children was mine. That same week, my wife's company was hosting its annual 4th of July party at the owner's house. I had no interest in going, but I was expected to attend. Sherry was one of the top-performing saleswomen at the firm, and her presence was required. By this point, I had everything I needed: tapes, photos, audio recordings, video footage, receipts, and now the DNA test results. I just hadn't figured out the best way to use them. One thing was clear: no matter what I did or when I did it, I was going to lose something. Sherry told me this wouldn't be a family event, so the kids weren't invited. In hindsight, that was a blessing. We arrived at the party just after 11:30 a.m. I grabbed a beer, while she poured herself a glass of white wine. She was dressed in a yellow sundress, with no bra underneath, a light shawl, and 3-inch espadrille wedges. I had to admit, she looked good. I stayed relatively close to her, not enough to seem like I was following her, but enough to keep an eye on what she was up to. Delaney, her boss and lover, found her quickly. He whispered something in her ear before disappearing again, continuing to play the charming host. I knew he would be back, but in the meantime, I focused on Sherry's behavior. She kept glancing around nervously, checking to see where I was. By the time she had her third glass of wine, she had lost sight of me completely. Sherry never handled alcohol well. At this rate, she was one sip away from getting drunk. After she poured another full glass, I watched as she subtly slid toward the back of the massive yard. The owner's house sat on 2 acres of land, so there were plenty of hidden spots for someone to disappear. 2 of her work friends attempted to distract me, likely under Delaney's orders. I humored them just long enough to switch my beer for a glass of Coke. They were tipsy, which made it easy to keep an eye on Sherry without them realizing. She moved toward the garden shed and slipped around to the back, disappearing behind the door. This was it. I casually set my drink on the table and pulled out my phone, turning on the video camera. Taking my time, I walked toward the corner of the shed, making sure to stay out of sight. Once I reached the edge, I circled around the yard, approaching from the back gate. Peeking around the corner, I finally saw her. Sherry's sundress was hiked up to her waist, exposing her bare chest to the warm sun and the light breeze. Delaney had her pressed against the shed, his hands all over her, while she moaned loudly into his ear. On the grass beside them, I spotted her white lace panties, discarded carelessly on the ground. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. As much as it disgusted me, I couldn't have asked for better timing. I stopped recording the video and switched to photo mode, snapping a few clear images. Then, I waited. As soon as they finished, I moved in. Without hesitation, I grabbed Delaney's scrawny-looking ass and yanked him away from my wife, pulling him off of her in one swift motion. He barely had time to react before I spun him around and drove my fist into his face, breaking his nose and his left cheekbone in a single hit. Pain shot through my hand instantly. I had broken something in the process. Delaney collapsed to the ground, completely unconscious. Sherry, caught off guard, slumped down against the shed, breathless and stunned. I didn't stop. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them onto Delaney's wrists, securing him to the nearby fence post. Then, I began reading him his rights. He was under arrest for sexual assault. Anything he said could and would be used against him in court. Sherry, still disoriented, suddenly snapped back to reality. She began screaming, demanding to know what I was doing. Ignoring her, I continued. Delaney had the right to an attorney, and if he couldn't afford one, the state would appoint one for him. He needed medical attention, but at the moment, I didn't care. Sherry, now fully hysterical, struggled to get up, but her legs were still too weak. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911. The operator answered immediately. Identifying myself, I gave them my badge number, reported my location, and stated that I had a suspect in custody for sexual assault. I requested backup, a supervisor, and an ambulance at the scene. The party was still in full swing, and the commotion had drawn several people toward the back of the yard. Sherry, her voice shaking, tried to protest. She insisted that this wasn't what it looked like, that it wasn't rape. I looked at her coldly. That's exactly what this was going to be. I had video footage, audio recordings, photographs, receipts, timestamps of her whereabouts. and the DNA test results proving that none of our children were mine. There was nothing left for her to deny. She could either cooperate, or she would never see her children again. The color drained from her face, and her body gave out beneath her as she collapsed onto the ground, screaming in denial. Her hands trembled, and her breath came in uneven gasps. I pulled her back up, wrapping her in her shawl, giving her one last chance to decide. As she sobbed into the fabric, she muttered something about needing her panties. I almost laughed at the irony. She hadn't needed them a few minutes ago, so why was she asking now? I told her to leave them at the crime scene for the investigators. Helping her to her feet, I guided her across the backyard toward the house. As we approached the gathering, about a dozen guests standing outside fell silent. Their conversations halted as they took in Sherry's disheveled appearance, her tear-streaked face, her messy dress, and the way she clung to me for support. They stepped aside without a word, making way for us. I sat her down in an empty lounge chair, where she hunched forward, still trembling. Two of her tipsy friends, Cecil and Rose, rushed over, their voices rising with concern as they demanded to know what had happened. There was no point in avoiding the truth. I told them the reality of the situation. Their boss had forced himself on Sherry. Cecil's face went pale as she repeated my words in shock. Rose, equally stunned, practically shrieked, insisting that they had no idea. When I asked if they truly believed that, they hesitated. According to them, Sherry had claimed she and I had an open marriage, that I had approved of her affairs. I shook my head at their naivete. She had lied to them, just like she had lied to me. Before they could react further, the police arrived. I directed two officers to the garden shed, instructing them to read Delaney his rights again. I wasn't sure he had heard me the first time. A replacement sergeant arrived with another patrol officer, and I had the new officer take statements from Cecil and Rose, as well as their contact information. Meanwhile, murmurs spread through the crowd as more people gathered, trying to make sense of the scene. Then, Delaney's wife appeared. She pushed her way through the crowd, eyes blazing with fury, demanding to know what had happened. The sergeant calmly explained that her husband had been arrested for assaulting Sherry. The news hit her like a shockwave. The anger in her expression sharpened into something almost dangerous before she lunged toward Sherry. Sherry didn't react. Her body had practically shut down, her vacant stare locked on the ground as if she wasn't even present in her own mind. Before she could reach her, the officers restrained Delaney's wife, pulling her back. Not long after, the paramedics arrived, and I briefed them on the situation. They moved quickly to assess Sherry, and when they helped her stand, I noticed a small puddle of fluid left behind on the lounge chair. Delaney's disgusting act had left its mark on her. She started sobbing again. I instructed the medics to take her to a trauma center, where she could be checked for any physical injuries. A short while later, two officers brought Delaney over, his face swollen, hands cuffed behind his back. He looked dazed, still processing what had happened. He made the mistake of speaking. He insisted that it had been consensual, that he and Sherry had an understanding. His wife's fury erupted at his words. She lunged at him, shouting insults, barely held back by the officers. Her voice was full of rage as she warned him that he would be hearing from her lawyer. I followed them to the station, where I filled out the necessary paperwork. After all, Sherry was still legally my wife. Once Delaney was booked, I went to the precinct and filed a formal complaint against him under oath. Since it was a Saturday, he wouldn't be arraigned until Monday. Delaney tried to call his lawyer, but his wife had already beaten him to it. After finishing the paperwork, I headed to the reception area. Sherry was waiting there, looking worse than I had ever seen her. When she noticed me, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. She tried to smile, but the moment she saw my cold expression, her face fell, and her entire body tensed. I stepped closer, my voice devoid of emotion, and asked her how long this had been going on. Her hands trembled, and her eyes filled with fresh tears. She tried to explain that it had only been a brief mistake, something that wasn't meant to last. She hadn't planned for it to go this far. Something inside me snapped. I leaned in just enough to make sure she heard every word. None of the kids were mine. Not our youngest, not Otis, not even Tracy. 17 years of marriage, and not one of them was mine. I let the words settle, watching as realization dawned in her eyes. Her regret didn't last long. It flickered for only a moment before she straightened up, wiped her tears, and let out a slow, bitter laugh. Her voice turned mocking as she told me I should have figured it out sooner. She was free to do whatever she wanted, and I had never had a clue. Something in me died in that moment. I looked at her and saw nothing. No love, no connection, no history worth remembering. She must have sensed the shift in my expression because her entire demeanor changed. She seemed to shrink before my eyes, her confidence crumbling as her voice dropped to a whisper. She clutched at her arms as she asked what was wrong with her, but I had no answer for her. Without another word, I took her by the wrist, pulled her up, and led her to my car. I placed her in the passenger seat, got in, and started driving. The entire way, she just stared blankly out the window, lost in whatever thoughts were racing through her mind. Eventually, I pulled up in front of a modest two-story house. She finally spoke, her voice quiet and unsure. She asked where we were and insisted that she just wanted to go home. I didn't look at her as I stepped out of the car. I had no interest in giving her what she wanted. I opened her door, pulled her out, and walked her up to the front porch. Ringing the doorbell, I waited. After a few moments, the door opened, and her father, Dylan, stood there, frowning as he took in her appearance. I didn't waste time on explanations. I simply told him that his daughter needed to stay with him for a while. I would return tomorrow to explain everything, but for now, she needed to be somewhere safe. Dylan looked at me as if I had two heads, clearly trying to process the situation. I didn't wait for a response. Turning away, I walked back to the car and drove off. After dropping Sherry off at her parents' house, I turned off my phone and headed home. The moment I stepped inside, the kids were waiting for me, their faces full of questions. They wanted to know where their mother was. I kept my response simple. She was staying with their grandparents for a while. There was no easy way to explain what had happened, but they deserved the truth. I gave them a careful version of the events, sparing them the more disturbing details. Even so, the weight of it hit them hard. There were tears, sniffles, and stunned silence before they finally admitted that while they understood why I did what I did, they couldn't understand why she had done what she did. I had no answers for them. Welcome to the club. After checking on them, I locked myself in my office and organized every piece of evidence I had. Reports, surveillance footage, photographs, receipts, and transcripts. I put together 4 separate packages, carefully leaving out the DNA test results for now. Once everything was in order, I called my lawyer and told her it was time. The divorce filing was set in motion, and I requested a restraining order using the police report and evidence from the case. The DNA results were sealed inside a special packet, reserved for legal purposes only. With that done, I went to Delaney's house to speak with his wife, Chloe. She answered the door cautiously, her expression guarded, but when I apologized for disturbing her and explained that I was there to give her information that could help her, her posture softened. She took the packet I handed her, flipping through the contents briefly before looking up, visibly shaken. She thanked me quietly, still trying to process it all. I told her to use whatever she wanted. From there, I made one more stop, Sherry's parents' house. Her father answered the door, his face tired and drawn. Without preamble, I handed him one of the packages and told him, plain and simple, that his daughter needed help. He didn't say anything as he took it from me, and I didn't wait for a response. I left, knowing that no amount of explanations could fix what Sherry had done. The next day, the kids and I kept things as normal as possible. We went to church, then had breakfast at a diner, enjoying a simple meal together. I kept my phone turned off the entire day, ignoring the outside world for a little while. On Monday morning, I went back to work and checked the schedule for Delaney's arraignment. When the time came, I headed to the courthouse, taking a seat in the back to watch the proceedings unfold. His lawyer tried to dismiss the charges, arguing that the relationship had been consensual. They even produced statements from 2 women at the company, backing up his claim. The judge looked unconvinced, but in the end, she ruled that the case would be dismissed with prejudice, meaning that new charges could still be filed if additional evidence came to light. Delaney must have felt like he had one. As he left the courtroom, he glanced back at me and smirked, as if gloating. That smirk didn't last long. The moment he stepped into the hallway, a process server was waiting for him. Courtesy of his wife, Delaney was served divorce papers right then and there, along with a restraining order. I didn't even try to hide my amusement as I walked away. Not quite even yet. That evening, I went home and reviewed the latest reports from the case, including the final rape kit analysis. As I flipped through the pages, my stomach twisted. The biological father of my youngest daughter was Delaney. I was still trying to process that when someone knocked on my front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. There was only one person I knew who knocked instead of ringing the bell. Standing there was Anthony, my brother-in-law, and Sherry's older brother by about 3 years. He was successful, owning his own construction company, and although there had been rumors of past mafia ties, I had never asked questions. A few years back, when his son got into serious trouble with drugs, I had helped him pull some strings, 99% legal, to get the kid into rehab. Now, his son was in his 3rd year of seminary school, thriving. Because of that, Anthony had always been grateful to me, and I had become his favorite brother-in-law, which meant that this was not a social visit. The kids rushed to greet him, excited as always. They loved him, his wife Heather, and their 3 kids, and for a moment, I let them enjoy the distraction. But Anthony wasn't here for them. Once he managed to break free from their hugs, he looked at me with a serious expression and gestured toward the back of the house. We stepped onto the porch, and the second the door closed behind us, he turned to face me. His voice was sharp with frustration as he demanded to know what was going on. Sherry was at their parents' house, physically unwell, and their father was furious. At first, she had been talking, but the moment their father showed her the files I had given him, she had shut down completely, refusing to answer any questions. Anthony had asked to see the documents himself, but their father had refused. I let out a tired sigh. He wanted answers, so I gave them to him. I told him everything. For 17 years, his sister had been cheating on me. Not one of our children was biologically mine. She had been with so many different men that I doubted she even knew who fathered Tracy or Otis. As for our youngest, her biological father was Delaney. The worst part? Sherry had a sexually transmitted disease, gonorrhea, and she was pregnant again, though it was obviously not mine. By the time I finished, Anthony looked like he had been hit with a sledgehammer. He dropped into a chair, rubbing his face, looking like he had aged years in just a few minutes. He mumbled something under his breath about whether there was any chance of fixing things, if I would even consider staying. I shook my head before he could finish the thought. There was nothing to fix. I had already filed for divorce, and Sherry would be served papers by the end of the week. Anthony sat there for a long moment, his expression full of regret and disbelief. Then, after a long breath, he nodded. He understood. And even though the court had dismissed the charges against Delaney, that man's life was already falling apart. His wife had left him, and she now had access to all the evidence I had given her. Anthony sighed, staring out at the dark yard, processing everything. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. I didn't want to be too harsh toward Sherry's parents, but with the attitude she had now, I couldn't risk them getting the wrong information from her. She needed serious psychological help, and I wasn't going to be the one to provide it. Anthony understood, though he admitted he was still trying to process it all. He wasn't the only one. After a bit more conversation, he stood up to leave, but before he did, he asked what I was going to do about Delaney. I was honest. I didn't know. Whatever I did, it would come back to bite me. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, but the reality was that she wasn't worth going to jail over. Anthony held my gaze for a long moment before telling me not to worry. He assured me that it wouldn't come back to haunt me, that I was still family, and that Delaney would eventually get what he deserved. He made it clear that he wouldn't harm his sister, but that Delaney's actions wouldn't go unanswered. I told him not to do anything reckless, but he just gave me a look, asked what I was talking about, and walked out before I could say anything else. A few days later, on Thursday, Sherry was served with divorce papers at her parents' house. The moment she realized what they were, she passed out, and they had to rush her to the emergency room. She remained in the hospital for nearly a week before returning home. Shortly after, her father came to see me, looking for some way to fix things. He asked if there was any possibility of reconciliation, but I couldn't believe he was even asking that after everything I had shown him. I reminded him exactly what his daughter had done. Not just one mistake, but 17 years of deception, multiple affairs, getting pregnant by another man, and passing off his child as mine while shutting me out of her life completely. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. I was glad the kids weren't home when I said all of this, because I didn't hold back. After letting out every ounce of frustration, I finally told him to convince her to sign the papers because I was done. He wasn't happy about it, but neither was I. Too bad. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Delaney had vanished. He had been notified about his divorce proceedings nearly a month earlier, but when his lawyer tried to set up a meeting, he simply never showed up. At first, I assumed he was just being difficult, but then I learned that his wife had taken full control of their company, which had been registered in her name for tax purposes. She wasn't concerned about his whereabouts. In fact, she had amended her divorce filing to make it clear that she was the one leaving him, not the other way around. His divorce process was still ongoing, but now that he had disappeared, it would take at least a year to finalize. As for Sherry, she was 2 months pregnant, which meant we had to wait another 7 months before our divorce could be finalized. That was the law. So, as much as I wanted this all to be over, I had no choice but to wait it out. During that time, her lawyer tried to push for a better settlement, arguing that she deserved more. I countered with my own offer. She could keep the house and receive a small percentage of our savings. In return, she would have limited visitation with the kids, only allowed to see them one weekend every 2 months at her parents' house, with no male companions present. To my surprise, she refused to see Tracy at all. Her lawyer pushed back on nearly every condition, so I told my lawyer to set up an in-person meeting. On the day of the meeting, I arrived 30 minutes early, loaded a DVD into the projector, grabbed a cup of coffee, and waited. Sherry arrived with her lawyer, who tried to start things off on a civil note. Sherry, however, had no interest in pleasantries. The negotiations dragged on for 4 hours, with no agreement in sight. Every offer was met with arguments and refusals, until finally, Sherry lost her temper, shouting that I was being unreasonable. I decided it was time to end this once and for all. Reaching for the remote, I pressed play on the DVD. The screen came to life with security footage from the Comfort Suites parking lot, showing Sherry and Delaney walking out together, laughing and touching each other intimately. She had never seen this footage before. The video continued until the exact moment she had pulled out the blue lace panties I had given her for our anniversary, panties she had handed over to Delaney like a trophy. I paused the video and turned to her. She was ashen, her jaw slack, completely unable to speak. Looking directly at her, I asked one simple question. Where were the anniversary panties? For the first time, she had no answer. I made it clear. If she didn't sign the agreement as it was, we would take everything to court, and the entire story would become public knowledge. She burst into tears, grabbed the pen, and signed everything without another word. Even her lawyer looked stunned, watching as she stood up abruptly, clutching her purse, when suddenly, her water broke. Within minutes, she was being rushed to the hospital, where she gave birth to a baby boy weighing 3 kilograms. My lawyer immediately filed for a DNA test, and just as expected, the child wasn't mine. But in an unexpected twist, he wasn't Delaney's either. She had cheated on her lover, too. The divorce was finalized shortly after, and for the first time in almost 2 decades, I was free. Over the next few months, I found myself getting a lot of attention. Apparently, I had become quite popular in the singles market, something my daughter found amusing. She told me I was considered a hunk, while my son jokingly warned me to be careful or I might get attacked. At some point, I went to visit Anthony, and over a couple of beers, I casually asked if he knew what had happened to Delaney. Anthony raised an eyebrow and asked, "Who?" I decided not to press further. Some things were better left unknown. Over the next 2 years, I went on a few dates, but my heart wasn't really in it. Then, one day, Tony and Heather hosted a party at a bar, inviting everyone, including Sherry. The kids stayed far away from her, and the man she had brought with her. However, their little half-brother was full of energy, and despite everything, my daughters adored him. Tracy, now 18, had even brought a young man to the party. He seemed decent, but I was still keeping an eye on him, In truth, I liked him, but there was no way I was going to let her know that just yet. At one point, I noticed Sherry's date eyeing my daughter, and just as I was about to step in, her boyfriend handled it himself. The man tried to get too close, and Tracy quickly punched him in the throat, then twisted his hand until his thumb snapped painfully. As he screamed in pain, she calmly told him she didn't share her mother's morals. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely proud. As the night continued, I was introduced to someone new, Sheila, Tony's sister. She had just moved into town, was a lawyer, and was raising a 10-year-old son alone after her husband had died in Afghanistan. She smiled at me and suggested that maybe, just maybe, we could help each other. Maybe, for the first time in years, I was ready to try.